Let's have a little chat about representation, specifically about the House of Representatives and a little mathematical dispute that went unresolved for about 150 years before we messed it up entirely. On a spectrum from everyone having power to only one person having power, humans have been trying to find the sweet spot somewhere in between the Athenians yelling at each other and Kim Jong-un, where we all can play and participate just enough and delegate the rest. Most citizens have neither the time nor space, so America's forefathers subscribed us to a representative democracy, somewhere in the middle, where individuals could elect individuals that we trust and exercise power on our behalf. To satisfy both large and small states, the founders forged a compromise. For the small states seeking equal representation, we formed the Senate with 2 seats each, for a total of 100 today. For the large states seeking a fair share for their larger populations and thus larger federal tax contributions, we formed the House, where seats are proportional to population. Today, the House has 435 members. So the biggest question of today is, where did this number come from? To find out, let's take a little trip down history lane, shall we? Our forefathers knew that the House should think, feel, reason, and act like the people. It should change every 2 years by popular vote, and it should increase in size with our population, which we'd count every 10 years with a census. In theory, this scaling mechanism would allow voters ongoing access to representatives and therefore the means to participate in their own government. But they struggled to figure out exactly how many members the House should have. Folks like James Wilson argued that the House should be determined most fairly by ratios. The concern with ratios, however, is that the House might grow too big and unwieldy over time. When the Constitutional Convention first set the maximum representation to 1 per 40,000 people, Madison and others called for a larger denominator for fear that the House would grow too large. While George Washington had been presiding quietly over the convention to add to its legitimacy, he finally spoke up at this point and expressed his only objection to the entire convention. Hearing Washington, everyone dropped the number to 30,000. And so they wrote up Article 1 of the Constitution, first to prevent having too many people by using that 30,000 ratio. They failed to agree, however, on a minimum to prevent underrepresentation, other than that every state needs to have at least one person. And that's it. That's as far as they got, leaving a really large range from 1 to 1,300 based on today's population. They needed to get the Constitution out the door for states to approve and figured Congress could sort it out later. Passing the Constitution wasn't easy. Many states protested because it did too little protect rights such as freedom of speech and religion. To sway them to pass it, founders promised 17 amendments that they would introduce to the first Congress. The minimum states ratified the Constitution. George Washington was elected our first president, and the new government kicked off on March 4th, 1789. As promised, James Madison introduced the amendments to the first House. Do you know how many of these amendments Congress adopted and sent to the states? It wasn't 17, but it wasn't 10. It was actually 12. Can you see which amendment tops the list? Yep, congressional apportionment. The House size was so important that it made the top of their agenda. The original First Amendment attempted to define a criteria breaking out what the minimum ratios would be up to reaching 200 members. When a joint committee between the House and Senate frantically reconciled revisions from both houses on all amendments, they kept the House's version the same, except that they accidentally made a typo, which would have made the amendment useless after we hit 8 million people. No one noticed before sending the Bill of Rights to the states for ratification. 10 states ratified the amendment before Delaware called out the error and refused to ratify it. Without Delaware's blessing, the amendment fell 1 state shy and didn't pass. The other amendments were all ratified except for the second, which limits Congress's power to set its own compensation, but we ended up ratifying that 200 years later in 1992. Without the typo and had it passed, we could have had as many as 6,600 representatives in the House today. The first Congress had 65 members, which was set by the Constitution. The second Congress kept the same while the first census was being counted. When numbers came back, they created a proposal for adding more seats. Their first draft gave 8 states numbers that exceeded the 30,000 overrepresentation ratio set by the Constitution. George Washington issued the first veto in American history, really the first veto in modern democracies. The House tried to override his veto, but failed to get 2/3 of the vote required. They caved and followed Jefferson's suggestion to use the fixed ratio of 1 per 33,000, increasing the number to 105 for the third Congress. From there, Congress and the president reached an agreement every 10 years on how much the House should grow until it hit 435 seats in 1911. Having just added 49 new members, things started to feel a bit crowded. When the 1920 census rolled around, results showed a massive shift to cities due largely to industrialization and immigrants coming from Europe. When proposed that the House increase to 483 seats, with most new seats going to more urban states, fierce debate broke out. Republicans at the time questioned the validity of the results, arguing they could not have accurately counted folks who had relocated for the war effort, rural men fighting in the war, or residents on remote properties during a brutal winter. In reality, they actually feared the growing number of immigrants and knew the shift would redistrict them out of their seats. So for the first time in history, Congress failed to grow. This debate dragged on for 9 years, and time was running out before the 1930 census. The House had gone nearly 2 decades without updating districts, leaving growing states like California wildly underrepresented and under-resourced, and the Electoral College looking less and less reflective of the population. Fortunately for electoral legitimacy, Hoover won both the popular vote and the Electoral College. Having previously overseen the Census Bureau, he anticipated the constitutional crisis of failing to increase the House size and demanded that Congress reach a solution. At long last, Congress proposed the Permanent Reapportionment Act of 1929 to keep the House size at 435 for good. Essentially, we would just have the Department of Commerce enter the census results into the equivalent of a spreadsheet every 10 years. No need for debate or funny math, no risk of a constitutional crisis ever again, problem solved. While representatives of urban states didn't like it, they conceded so they could finally close their gaps. Congress passed the law by simple majority, Hoover signed the act into law, and it has been law ever since. We've had 435 seats for so long that most Americans assume it's constitutional, but it's not. It's an arbitrary number frozen in time by xenophobia and politics. With our population tripling since 1911, we've gone from members representing 200,000 people to about 760,000 people and counting. We're due to hit 1 million before the end of the century. With a cap, our representation weakens as the population grows. There are a lot of negative implications of weakening representation, which might explain why Americans despise Congress so much. For one, we're less represented than all 230 other countries who have legislatures, except India. Even North Korea pretends to have better representation than we do. To keep the number of 435, reapportionment needs to take some seats away to give to faster growing states. We call this zero-sum reapportionment. The result is that even when a state's population is growing, it can still lose seats. After the last census, all 7 of the states shown lost seats, but only Illinois and West Virginia actually lost people. In 1992, when Montana lost one of its 2 seats, Montanans were so pissed that the state sued to get it back. The case made it all the way to the Supreme Court, but they ruled unanimously that reapportionment was in Congress's power to decide. So taking recent population and dividing it, members represent an average of 760,000 people. However, our formula results in some representing more and others less than average. Looking at states with only 1 representative, the smallest, Wyoming, represents nearly 200,000 fewer people than average, and about 400,000 more than Delaware, which is the worst represented state in the nation. Meanwhile, Montana has about 90,000 more than Delaware, but that was just enough to earn its second seat back, averaging about 540,000 per district and making it the best represented state in the country. This means Montanans have 83% more say than Delawareans over what laws we pass and who we elect as president. Joke's on Delaware, I guess, for not passing the original First Amendment. 40% of people across half the states are underrepresented. The value of our votes depends on where we live, and that's more than a little unfair. In 2009, a bunch of voters from underrepresented states felt that it was so unfair that they sued en masse and contested district disparities between states. They only made it to federal district court, who made the unfortunate argument that disparities have always existed. The plaintiffs appealed, but the Supreme Court decided not to review the case. We have a handful of districts and territories, including Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico, with a total of 4 million U.S. citizens without representation in Congress. To add these territories and states, it would cost 9 different other states a seat each. Since capping the House, we've only brought on Alaska and Hawaii, and when we did that, we added 2 seats temporarily, then returned to 435 again. Without expanding the House, it's unrealistic Congress will ever add stars to our flag for fear that they may redistrict themselves out. With such massive districts, states have leeway to gerrymander their boundaries. While a few states have independent commissions to do this, most legislatures draw the boundaries themselves, resulting in some extremely biased outcomes that favor one party. The least discreet one I've seen is this broken-winged pterodactyl district in Maryland that strategically splits the state's Republican voters. More representatives would mean smaller districts, essentially chopping up the pterodactyl, mitigating the impacts of biased boundaries. And if you're not a fan of the Electoral College, having more smaller districts would help mitigate its trademark wonkiness. While the electoral margin happens to be trending to more closely resemble the popular margin, it's also trending towards dipping below 0 more often, which means we'd be electing more presidents who don't win the popular vote. We've seen this twice recently with Bush in 2000 and Trump in 2016. And it was really close again in 2020, where Trump lost the popular vote by over 7 million votes, but only needed 42,000 more across 3 states to tie the Electoral College and likely win. So buckle up, because we're on track to see more and more elections go sideways, and not necessarily to the Republicans' benefit either. By adding seats and therefore more electors to the college, we could indirectly dilute it. At a fundamental level, a cap on the House size means representatives have less time for us as our population grows. If we can believe that Congress works 70 hours per week, that means they have about 6,400 working hours per 2-year term to divvy up. Divided by the constituents, an average representative only has about 30 seconds per person, barely enough time to say hello. Subtract the 4 hours a day that they're encouraged to fundraise, and you're left with only 20 seconds per term. Elect someone who works the same as the average American or gets sick or goes on vacation, about 18 seconds. And if they keep up with fundraising, you're down to 9 seconds. If your representative goes to see the new Indiana Jones movie, she'll burn time that could otherwise be spent with 400 people. With scarce attention, you have to pay for more time with your representative. In 2022, 13,000 organizations spent $4 billion to hire lobbyists, which roughly results in a price of about $2,400 per hour with your representative. This arrangement, largely protected by free speech, benefits special interests and tends to threaten things like climate progress, protections against stuff that can kill us, labor standards, economic freedom, and ultimately trust in our government, especially when it's legal for people to offer gifts in exchange for favorable treatment. Other countries don't have this problem nearly as badly as we do, not because of America's flavor of capitalism, but because we simply have too few people to influence by those who can afford to play the game. If we were to add another 200 seats, special interests would need to spend another $1.5 billion to hire another 5,000 lobbyists to keep up. Even more seats than that, and it may become cost prohibitive for anyone to do so. A finite number of seats precludes minor political movements from disrupting the status quo. In the mid-1800s, when we had 1 per 89,000 people, we enjoyed some third-party action. Between the time the House last grew in World War II, after the ratio had tripled to 1 per 250,000, we still enjoyed a little action. Since then, our ratio has tripled again, and we've been lucky to see 1 or 2 independent representatives since. Our political duopoly has a vested interest in maintaining the two-party system, their brands, and the rules they have come to master in playing this game. Without adding seats, we're likely to be stuck in partisan hell. And that hell is sitting still. As districts grow, candidates have much larger blocks to appeal to and need much more money to do so. If you're not well-connected, famous, or independently wealthy, good luck running. Of those who took office this year, 96% of incumbents who didn't retire won their re-election. Only 7 were defeated. We got 18 new faces from districts created after the last census, but that only happens every 5 elections. If people don't lose their primary, lose their seats to redistricting, or retire, they have an insane chance of winning re-election. Without expanding the House size, we're stuck with an old boys club of lifers. Back in 1911, when the House size last grew, only men above the age of 21 had the right to vote, which effectively means 57% of today's eligible voters did not have voting rights back in 1911. Voting rights have expanded more than twofold since then, with the 19th, 24th, and 26th amendments, but we have not increased the House size twofold, let alone fourfold with our population, resulting in Congress falling dramatically short of proportionally representing the voting population. While this Congress is the most racially and ethnically diverse to date, we are still 106 female members and 73 non-white members shy of painting an accurate portrait of our nation. At the current rate, it'll take another 20 years for the House to catch up racially and another 50 for women to catch up. If we paused electing white men right now, we would need to add at least 250 seats to make room. So how many seats should there be exactly? Before we explore options, let's understand our bounds. To stay constitutional, we need to have at least 1 member per each state and no more than 11,000 members per the last census to stay under the ratio. For other benchmarks, we're much better represented locally. At the state level, there are about 1,900 total senators and about 5,400 total House members, and this doesn't include legislatures of the other territories. For another comparison, there are about 3,100 counties and county equivalents across the states in DC. If you look at the representation ratios for other countries, Pakistan is the next worst represented in the world, and Ireland is the most represented to keep us constitutional. Canada, the UK, and Israel, among others, fall somewhere in the middle. North Korea pretends to be somewhere up here. Now, let's explore some options for what the number could be. Based on our pain points, a solution should be constitutional, should show population and seat count moving in the same relative direction. It should be a fixed approach that doesn't need to be negotiated or interpreted every 10 years. It'll also need to be able to help us make space for more representational diversity in our House. So about the 215 number we just discussed. Option 1, let's party like it's 1911 and stick with 435. It's technically constitutional and so immutable that we're stuck, but it sucks. So what if we just set the ratio to the maximum of 1 per 30,000 people? Well, the way apportionment works, the individual ratios of 24 states would end up being on the edge of unconstitutional. So we need to find a more forgiving ratio than that. If states lose population as they have 37 times in history, we need a ratio that protects us from losing as many as 150,000 people, or at least 10% of the population in a 10-year span. The ratio of 40,000 roughly hits that sweet spot. It's difficult to imagine any state having a mass exodus of more than 30% of its population, but with climate migration, that's not out of the realm of possibility anymore. To prevent the smallest states from having overrepresentation, it's been suggested to pin the ratio to the population of the smallest state. With Wyoming being the smallest for 4 decades, this idea has come to be known as the Wyoming rule. With a recent population of about 577,000, that would net us 573 members in the House. That number hardly helps us with inclusivity, and we'd be hard-pressed to ever admit new states except maybe Puerto Rico or DC because the populations of those other territories are so much smaller than Wyoming. To be more inclusive, we could just cut Wyoming in half, netting us about 1,100 members and effectively setting a new minimum ratio of 2 representatives. While seemingly practical, these Wyoming rules are vulnerable to churn. It wouldn't realistically take too much to inspire 50,000 people to relocate to Wyoming within 10 years and knock about 45 or 90 districts nationwide. To protect from this, we could round up to the nearest 25 or 50,000, but at that point, we might as well just pick a fixed ratio and not worry so much about Wyoming. An even more popular solution is called the cube root law. Some political scientists have observed that taking the cube root of other nations' populations nets figures closely resembling the size of their legislatures. If we take the cube root of our population, we'd have 692 members today. Funny enough, America unintentionally followed this same trend for a while until the House was capped in 1929 and we went off the rails. If you're concerned about the House getting too big over time, the advantage of this method is that a curved approach leads to a continuously diminishing rate of increased proportionment. It's technically correlated with population growth, but less and less so as population goes up. And while 257 seats would be helpful, the US would only pass 3 countries in their representation ratios and still fall in the bottom 2% of countries worldwide. To find a more representative solution, we can look back at the original First Amendment. Had it not had a typo and passed, we'd have about 6,600 members today. Scholars have debated, however, whether it was intended for the amount to stop at 50,000. Had it not stopped and continued increasing with the minimum by 10,000 every 100 seats, we'd have around 1,600 members. Whether extrapolated or not, the amendment only offers a minimum and is not explicit about the ratio to use, leaving it up for debate every 10 years. And that way, it doesn't actually solve our problems. But if we were able to calculate a formula on the conservative lower bounds of the extrapolated series, it would look something like this. Tuned and simplified, we can follow the curve almost exactly by multiplying the square root of the population by roughly 9.7% and subtract 65 members, or the inaugural number of seats defined in the Constitution for the first Congress. This approach would give us about 1,709 members. A formula like this, if agreed upon, frees us from debate every 10 years and we can ride off into the sunset better represented. Okay, so reviewing the options, only the cube root law and founder's curve meet all of our success criteria. And as much as I would like for us to use the founder's curve, quadrupling the size of the House might be too big a shock and cost to the system. The cube root law is much more feasible to push through, so let's keep that one in mind as we continue. So what arguments do we need to overcome to increase the House size? Averting the risk of constitutional crisis was not the only reason Congress capped the House back in 1929. Representatives made many excuses then that they still make today when the subject comes up. For one, we're already unhappy with Congress, so why would we make it bigger on purpose? 69% of Americans say they want the House to stay the same or even shrink. But with just a little bit of historical context, that number shifted 6% in favor of increasing the House size. Learning what we've already learned, it's useful to consider 2 realities. First, when people call for smaller government, that doesn't mean fewer people. It means less power concentrated and exercised by the few. It seems a paradox, but more politicians would net a smaller government, rather than draining the swamp diluted with more fresh water. And second, to serve up growing constituencies, it would take more hands to keep up. Back in 1975, Congress capped employees a member could hire to 18. While we might not want more politicians, would we rather have more unelected staffers or more elected representation to keep up? They both require a simple vote of Congress. Legislatures would have you believe that adding players will make an already cumbersome process less efficient and trusting. There may even be more gridlock with so many more people to satisfy and possibly more staunch representatives. Congress will neglect to point out, however, that most legislative work happens in committees rather than on the House floor. Fewer representatives means fewer people thinking about fewer issues. The average congressperson is on 6 committees. Imagine juggling 6 nation-critical projects at work. Aside from making the whipping of votes more challenging, more representatives means more committees or greater attention to fewer committees. And having more means getting more done faster and better. We would be better equipped to legislate as the world continues to evolve rapidly around us. And given that social progress trends upwards with higher legislative headcounts in other countries, we should be able to figure this out. One of the longest standing arguments, and possibly my favorite, revolves around the physical space of the House itself. In 1920, the New York Times argued that for physical reasons, the growth of the House cannot be allowed to continue indefinitely. Representatives would still whine that more members means more uncomfortable working conditions and curtailed office or meeting space to the point where it adversely affect productivity, as if they were productive already. The reality, that chamber can fit a lot more than 435 people. Just watch the State of the Union. Representatives, senators, Supremes, cabinet, military, staff, reporters. That's at least 700 in one room. People who show up late might need to sit up in the gallery, but without question, we have room for at least 200 more. And frankly, if there really isn't enough room, we can build a new building. The old one is evidently not sacred enough to some Americans anyway. And the thought of physical space limiting representation is kind of a joke post-pandemic. The country survived for 2 years on video calls. They don't need to commute to a faraway land to get things done. They could have more time at home with their constituents and less time losing touch in corruptible offices in DC. The chamber itself is also almost always empty when you turn on C-SPAN. Only voting and debate ever fall on the floor, and both could be handled remotely. Real work happens in committees, and those could convene anywhere. And if they really needed more meeting space in DC, no worries, because DC follows the national trend of commercial office vacancies increasing post-pandemic. So how do we pay for it? The appropriations budget that funds the House is currently $800 million, which covers member salaries and allowances for staff, office, and expenses that combine total about $1.8 million per representative. Seems like a lot of money, and on one hand it is. Combined with an outside income allowance of 15% of their base pay, members can earn up to about $200,000. That's 2.8 times the median household income of Americans and lands them in the top 11% of earners. If we want to add 257 seats and keep the overall budget the same, members would need to shed about $650,000 through salary, staff, or expense cuts. If instead we wanted to raise taxes, it wouldn't cost that much. Each taxpayer currently pays about $5 to fund the House. To add 257 seats, Congress would need to bump the appropriations budget up by about $450 million, which would only cost taxpayers an average of $2.98 per year. Americans are well within our means, both financially, spatially, and technologically, to increase the House size while reducing the overall workload on existing members. So what's the real reason that Congress won't do it? Anyone who's mastered the game at 435 doesn't want the rules to change. No one with power or access to power will give it up lightly, and they have a vested interest in keeping district math the way that it is. Incumbents, the duopoly, special interests, foreign governments, and even the President of the United States all benefit from having fewer people to work with and sway. So what the hell can we do about it? First, we can try to convince our representatives that increasing House size benefits the people, honors the founders, is a change you're personally willing to afford, that lightens their burden, and assures that they have near zero risk of being redistricted out now or in the future. It also can't hurt to do their work for them by having a specific ask, namely that we want them to sponsor a bill that uses the cube root law to set the House size, the same method of allocating that the Department of Commerce uses today, and a phased approach to increasing the seats and budget over the course of 12 or so years. If you don't know who your representative is, you can find them on the GovTrack website. It's a little bit of a long shot, given the arguments we've discussed and limited time we have to be heard, but if we can appeal to representatives from states that are underrepresented, states who have lost seats, states at risk of losing seats, then maybe we can come close. The Democrats likely stand to benefit the most from the new districts created in more populous states, but don't tell that to Republicans in underrepresented states. We probably need to wait until Democrats control both houses in the presidency again, and even then it's a long shot to convince the Senate to go for all of this. If that doesn't work, we could do the next most American thing imaginable and sue somebody about it, specifically the Department of Commerce, and hope that our case makes it all the way to the Supreme Court for a definitive ruling. Montana already tried this in 1982, and underrepresented states tried it again in 2009. But the first response to Montana and the subsequent lack of response leaves the door open for future lawsuits if you're up for it. There are a number of things that make this a little prohibitive. For one, it takes a lot of money. Two, this court is a conservative majority that's likely to last the next 2 decades. And because 2 similar cases already made it to the court, it'll take a super clever legal twist for them to bother hearing the issue again. And never mind that the US public believes the court is going down the gutter. But if Congress won't do anything, and the Supreme Court won't do anything either, our final recourse lives in Article 5 of the Constitution. Our founders designed a process where 2/3 of state legislatures could call a convention to propose amendments themselves. Given that the state reps are far more available to us than federal ones, this method is not as far-fetched as it might seem. That said, it's never successfully been done before. States have, however, applied en masse enough to coerce Congress to beat them to it and pass an amendment themselves. The specific example of this is back in the early 1900s. Enough states called for an amendment to elect senators by popular vote that it spurred Congress to finally pass that amendment on their own. Thereafter, the only attempts that have come close to convening a convention by the states have been one to allow the states to dictate their own district size, which is not what we want, and another to balance the federal budget, which some would argue we probably need right now. Calling a convention and getting an amendment passed by these states is a very tall order. It'll take a lot of states to get on board, and we have a lot to figure out about the convention process, especially since it's never been done before. But if you look at all the states who are underrepresented, have lost or may lose seats or both, we could theoretically have enough to force Congress's hand, if not call a convention for the first time in history. So, real talk. Let's pretend that we're able to convince, sue, or inspire the states to coerce Congress to increase the House size. Once we finally have more representatives, would we achieve our outcome of increasing our representation? Would we feel heard on all things that matter to us? Would representatives mirror our values? Can money or anything else buy them away from us? By setting any number, we would still have an upper limit on representation. Politicians and their staffs would still have limited attention for us, even if it climbs to as much as 10 minutes per staffer. Politicians have their own biases. They can't truly think, feel, reason, or act like all of us because they're just one person. Lastly, politicians and staffers still need to fundraise and get paid. Money in politics isn't going away. So what else can we do? If AI can render images better than most artists, beat any human in ancient board games, and pass the bar exam, you better bet that they could represent us and write stronger legislation than many of the people in office. AI in government might sound like science fiction and hype, but it's already happening. AI is being used to generate political ads, target audiences in campaigns, intake law enforcement queries, and represent defendants in court. If AI could represent us in Congress, or at least empower members of Congress to hear us better, we can open the doors to a 24/7 town hall, make far better sense of all the noise, and drive engagement in government like never before. We could try what the Athenians tried, but actually succeed. To paint this picture for you, let's call our AI Sam. Think about Sam as an anonymous suggestion box, but one that actually listens, breaks down issues, facilitates widespread discourse on the most divisive topics, and teases out solutions to our problems. If we could tell Sam how often we want questions asked of us, we could participate as much as or as little as we like. Through conversational UI and generated micropulse, Sam could help facilitate the process of listening to your concerns, confirming that others share those concerns, asking around for solutions to the problem raised, triangulating favored solutions, generating proposals for legislation that everyone can react to, and tracking the will of the people through Congress. House members cannot ignore Sam for long. If Sam helps track how representatives vote based on their constituents' values, their perceived performance is at stake. Emergent candidates could use Sam to outlisten to constituents, and incumbents would eventually need to fight fire with fire. Through these mechanisms, we could better hold our representatives accountable to voting along constituent lines rather than party or lobbyist lines. If built right, AI representatives could have numerous advantages over humans. They have no need for rest or play and can work for the people year-round. They don't need to fit you into their schedule or hear from you in a crowded town hall. They can pay attention to you and everyone else simultaneously wherever you are and for however long you want them to. If engineered openly and securely, they cannot be bribed or corrupted, leaving special interests to appeal to Americans directly. They can be held accountable through code. If we're not happy with their performance, we can vote at any time to change it. They behave. They do not have secrets to keep, tax returns to hide, conflicting interests, or scandals to cover up. They have no advantages over other representatives, and we have no advantages over others participating. They can't be prejudicial to whom they listen to. They can circulate ideas anonymously, averting our own biases. They have no single socioeconomic, racial, or sexual identity. They can fractionally empathize with and reflect all demographics in their constituency. And finally, their political identities can be dynamically shaped by their constituents, thereby weakening parties and partisanship in our country. On the dystopian side of things, AI built in private and trained on today's politicians can immortalize the fools we have today, spread disinformation, and manipulate voters to horrific effects. On the utopian side, AI built in public and trained on the people themselves could dignify us like never before, generate the most viable solutions to our problems, and hold our government accountable to delivering on those solutions. For this to work, AI models would need to be much more transparent and have a lot more oversight than they do today. And we'd still want the Senate and president around to defend against runaway populism onset by crafty AI. But when AI becomes powerful enough to listen to crowds, draft widely accepted legislation, and hold Congress accountable, it's only a matter of time before the House members become purely ornamental. To do without them entirely, though, we'd need to gut the Constitution. And it'd take a lot more work than just increasing our House size, so maybe let's try to do that first. So to wrap it up, when Congress capped the House size at 435 members nearly 100 years ago, they kicked off a bobsled ride to corporate oligarchy that continues to accelerate as our population grows and leaves us less and less represented every single day. Permanent reapportionment violates our rights as Americans, otherwise equal under the law, by varying district sizes and the worth of our votes, which, among other things, leaves us with the second lowest representation ratio in the world. Representatives of very little time for us that can be lobbied away. Crazy district shapes, a wonky electoral model, high re-election rates, and officials who hardly look or think like the American people. We can no longer accept 435 as a sacred number. to honor the founders' intent to have a House that mirrors and grows with the people, and to better legislate on behalf of Americans in these complex and changing times. We need to repeal the Permanent Reapportionment Act of 1929, and we need to replace it with a formula like the cube root law to gracefully scale our representation. If we don't do this, we may realize deep fears that the country cannot solve our biggest problems. Representation is not a partisan issue. It's an existential one. Through passing no other simple law could we force more restorative change in our government. If we can't convince Congress, the courts, or the states, we may need to take representative accountability into our own hands. And I'd rather it be through software and democratic innovation than guns and violent insurrection. Given how uphill the first three options are, I'm down to get to work on SAM if anybody's up for it.